a second, share. Yeah, here we are. That's it. Okay, so, and that's it. There we are. Okay, so that's my title. It's rather grand, but I've tried to give you a sort of setup and a sort of justification. And I wanted to go right back to when people thought about the conservation was a thing. There are probably older examples, but it's worth remembering that in Victorian times, this was a debate point. And this gentleman here, John Clayton, he was town clerk of Newcastle upon Tyne, and he deplored the fact when he went on his horse into the country around Newcastle that the farmers were dismantling Hadrian's Wall. And of course, if you're a person living near a construction with big blocks that nobody seems to care about, why wouldn't you take them away? They're nice square blocks and you can build a cow's byre with them. But he was one of the first who actually thought, no, this isn't right. You know, if we completely dismantle Hadrian's Wall, and people knew it was Roman, they knew the history. And so he had to do it in a practical way. He couldn't persuade people. So he went out buying farms on both sides of the wall. And I think eventually, of course, the mindset changed and people came to realize, of course, there is a sort of public good and we have to be responsible. And of course, it was the same through much of Victorian times and in every country with regard to wildlife conservation. I know that David Attenborough is very ancient, but of course, he didn't live in Victorian times and there was no strong voice protecting wildlife. And this is to remind you, of course, of one of the most striking public cases which really brought it to people's attention. And so this lady's very fine hat represents the death of several ostriches and heaven knows what else to render the feathers. And I've put down a few facts and figures there, which I won't read all of those. But I think that in terms of historical conservation and archaeology, in a way that kind of came first. Then I suppose conservation of animals, and particularly the visible animals. People cared about birds. They think birds are beautiful. We had already killed numerous birds, famously the dodo, the great auk, the passenger pigeon in North America, the quagga, a zebra-like mammal. These were all killed just, 100 years ago or more. But when we look at the historical records, London was an entrepot for the trade in feathers. And just look at these numbers of feathers that were being sold in the marketplace. And just as one example, the heron, thousands and thousands of herons are being killed just to provide plumes for the market. And nobody cared. And then I think people were thinking, we can't find any more herons. This is very inconvenient. What should we do? And the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds was formed because there was no chance of government legislation at the time, actually by a group of concerned women in 1889. And if some of you will know the history, oh, for goodness sake. So conservation geology, of course, that didn't come until much later. And you might wonder why conserve geological features, or how people would look at them and think, well, they're going to survive forever. So why would we need to put any special measures in? But this is the Borolonite locality, which I mentioned at the start. And that's one example. Maybe people should have noted that there's a limited area of outcrop of this rock type, and we should maybe limit collecting to some extent. Even more difficult, and with a very strong Scottish relevance, are Pleistocene landscapes. It's very easy just to dig them away, to remove the sand and remove the moraine. And of course, recent discoveries on Skye, like dinosaur footprints. Are they better left where they are, where everybody can see them, or do we dig them up, allow people to take them away, or even put them into museums? It's a sort of tricky one to try and get that right. Now, this is where Britain took a lead. And there will be other countries that were thinking about these things at the time, but this was the first concerted government effort in 1949 And I managed to find this image of the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act, 1949. And the Nature Conservancy Council, or Nature Conservancy as it was first called, dates back to this post-war act. And so after the war, people remember, of course, the NHS and universal education and all these other good things that came in after the Second World War. But there was also a substantial revision to planning law, and this as well, a realization that we needed to do something. The National Trust had started before the war as a sort of private enterprise membership type of thing, but clearly people realized there is no way that we can allow private engagement simply as the only way to protect the countryside. And amazingly, for geology, buried within this is coverage of geologically important sites, somehow unexpected. It wasn't intended. I'm not quite sure why they did it, but thank goodness they did. So the concept of SSSIs dates back to this 1949 Act. The Nature Conservancy, which covered the whole of the UK, was established in the early 50s as a result of this. And the concept of SSSIs was not that the government would buy the land, it was meant to be a by agreement, a development of understanding by the owners. And many of them are small, but many of them, of course, are quite extensive. Some of them are on coasts, so that's public land. Many of them are on private land. And the assumption was that the Nature Conservancy or local officers would have the role of speaking to landowners and explaining to them why this site is important, why it's part of the heritage of the nation, why it has some kind of international importance. And all done then, not from a point of view of you can monetize this, you can earn money, you can charge people to look at this or something, but purely for good reasons, scientific and cultural heritage, something like that. And so the first lists of SSSIs were made in the 1950s, both on the biology side. Of course, that's when people began to identify important habitats, locations where you find extraordinary orchids or other remarkable forms of wildlife, nesting areas for ospreys and golden eagles. All those purely biological sites were designated at that time, as well as geological. So a lot of geological stratotypes like Dobbs Lynn in the southern uplands, which is the world standard location for the boundary between the Ordovician and Silurian, they were put into these lists. There's a lot of rather obvious ones. Stonesfield near Oxford, which is the source of fossil mammals and dinosaurs, and a lot of the Dorset coast, for example, and indeed many localities in the Northwest Geopark area as well, were already recognized. But I think by the 1970s, people realized, the Nature Conservancy Council had conducted a thorough overhaul of the biological sites for all sorts of reasons, but including the legal challenge aspect that if you go to court and say this is the best wetland for these kinds of birds in the country, you'd better be sure that you're right in making that claim. And I think there had been some legal challenges where the Nature Conservancy in different parts of the UK had been kind of embarrassed because they didn't have the briefing documents that they needed. They were making assertions. And so this is what I joined in 1981. The Geological Conservation Review was quite well funded. They appointed, in the end, about 50 or so individuals. People like myself, I just finished my PhD. I was kind of looking for a job. And this was like a dream job. We'll employ you for a year to visit all the British fossil reptile sites, all the dinosaur sites. So I was all over the place, not so much in Scotland, but we did go to Skye and Egg and various other, Hugh Miller's Bone Bed, places like that. And of course, Elgin, which is where I worked on the Elgin reptiles from the Triassic. And I was also involved in the fish volume. There's a great number of SSSIs, of course, in the Old Red Sandstone, as well as mammals and birds. They're mainly from the south of England. So it's very thorough. There was an attempt to go through all the different fossil groups, all the different rock units, so from Precambrian through to Pleistocene. There's a whole section, of course, for geomorphology and different kinds of Pleistocene landscapes, etc., etc. And for example, on my job, I was looking at the reptile sites. I spent a few months reading everything I possibly could. I identified about 1,000 possible sites around the whole of the UK and tried to sort them into categories and began whittling them down, and then visited 200 or 300 of them. And this was what I was paid to do. And then in the end, whittled it down to 50. And then for each of those 50, my job was to write a 10-page report, focusing on the question of why is this an SSSI? And making these claims. This is the best locality in the UK for dinosaurs, or this is the best locality in Europe for early Cretaceous dinosaurs, or this is the best locality in the world for something or other. And so that documentation had to be scientifically justifiable, but it also had to be written in a way that assertions were documented and supported by evidence, so that if there were a case, and some of you may be familiar with various threats and cases and legal issues, discussions, at least the relevant portion of the natural conservation statutory bodies across the different nations would have at their disposal already the basic briefing document. And these are the geological SSSIs, which are remarkably uniformly scattered over Great Britain. Northern Ireland had its own a separate one, and sadly they're not plotted there. And the volumes came out. That's the introductory volume. There's a series of 50 of these. They're nearly all published, but there's still a few remaining ones to come out. And I think you can get access to most of them online. But you know, the level of detail, there are several volumes covering the Precambrian, for example. And how do these match with the different kinds of other modes of natural conservation? So you'll all be familiar, I'm sure, with this map, which shows many of the SSSIs in yellow. So a lot of the Scottish SSSIs are very big. The ones that I designated around Elgin are hardly visible. They're just tiny quarries. So Lossiemouth Quarry and Spiny Quarry and Cutty's Hillock and Burgh Head. So, you know, these are the different localities around there for the Triassic reptiles. But of course, many of the other SSSIs are quite substantial. And of course, a great number of them up here in yellow. And then the other kinds of special areas of conservation, special protection areas and wetlands, many of you will be much more knowledgeable about those than I am. But it's helpful to see there's a degree of overlap and common purpose. And of course, the Geopark absorbs a lot of these categories of types of sites with different legal frameworks. There is a concept of geotourism. This is particularly what, of course, I've talked so far about the scientific legalistic aspect. Of course, geotourism is important, and this is a really strong aspect, of course, of what all the geoparks do. And I think this is what really motivates the development of geoparks in nearly every nation on Earth where they're being developed. And here we have our tourist mega spenders. Of course, we don't see the tourists simply as a source of money. We see them as excellent citizens who are taking an interest and wish to know and wish to be informed about the area. So key elements, it should be geologically based, of course. There has to be a particular reason. The Northwest Geopark has this remarkable succession of Precambrian rocks, which documents some of the oldest life on Earth. Other geoparks, for example, the Jurassic Coast in Dorset, is totally different. Its purpose is all about dinosaurs and documenting the Mesozoic rock succession. Sustainability is very important. That's not a question to do with SSSIs. It's assumed that they are sustainable. They have to be. You can't just let them go. But of course, in terms of a geopark, it has to be sustainable in terms of the economy, but also all sorts of other aspects of how it operates. Geologically informative, that's the educational aspect. It's all very well professional geologists banging on about different things, but we have to make it accessible, as you well know. And that's a great fun part of the whole process, is justifying yourself in words that people will appreciate. And it's important because it helps us to keep focused on what we're doing. Locally beneficial, of course, massively important, so that there is good engagement from everybody who lives around, and they don't see this as an imposition, but see this as something, actually, this is good, I like this, I knew nothing about it, but actually this is fun and this is great. And generates tourism satisfaction. One hopes that people go away happy with what they've done and perhaps recommend it to others. Again, many of you will be very familiar with these words. This is from one of the UNESCO websites, and there they summarize most of those points. An area with geological heritage of significance, with a coherent and strong management structure, sustainable economic development strategy in place, geological heritage and knowledge is shared and linked with the broader aspects of nature and cultural environment. So just to step through the red highlights, the geological heritage of significance is really important. That's the headline justification for the whole thing. And that ought to be made very clear to people, anybody who asks. It's in the educational material, it's in the technical papers, it's in the planning documents, it's in everything. The headline point is whatever it is. This is a geopark because it has this really important international role in our understanding of the history of the Earth. The strong management structure, of course, so that it can continue, and that, of course, you're very well familiar with that, and your AGM is all part of that. The sustainable economic development strategy, I'm aware, is very different in different parts of the world. When I see how geoparks are being developed in China, I'm astonished at the amount of money they throw at them. And it will be earned back, but they don't expect it to be earned back in a very immediate manner. And I realize a difficulty in the UK is that we're constantly challenged to become sustainable. Speaking from the universities, we are treated in the same way. We are supposed to be able to finance everything that we do, which can be very difficult. The sharing of knowledge, the education, of course, massively important and pitched at very different levels: children, local landowners, visitors, etc., etc. So Knock Crag, which many of you will be very familiar with, made attractive by decent footpaths, sculptures, other attractions to appeal to different people, and being aware that some people can and wish to walk long distances, other people have to park and can't walk long distances, but would still feel they ought to be able to get something from it. And of course, that's challenging, but has been achieved. And more from the UNESCO words that are reflected in the way the geopark works. And it's not just about rocks, of course. UNESCO stresses this point time and time again, but it's to, if there are areas of cultural enhancement and building economic benefits for local people within the area, of course, massively, massively important. So again, I was checking the UNESCO website, and they are all based on scientific evidence, which is massively important. And in discussing these with colleagues in China and other parts of the world, they get those points, and they are, in making their bids, in making their cases to their local governments and higher level governments to secure funding, they still stress that point. This is not just an excuse for building hotels and pulling in tourists. We actually have to be able to make a strong scientific case. In China, though, for example, this is not coupled with a system of SSSIs. So we have that, what might seem greater complexity, but I believe is a much stronger model. Whereas in China, they really, as far as I can see, they just have geoparks, which is a massive weakness, because having the geoparks is fantastic, but then so many SSSIs or so many equivalents, really important geological sites, don't lend themselves to being part of a geopark. And the majority of SSSIs, of course, are not in geoparks and probably never will be. And it would be wrong to try and pack them all into geoparks in some sense, or we'll drop these 5 over here and we'll replace them with another 5 in the geopark 100 miles away. You can't do that. The geology is where it is, and sometimes it's under a city or in the midst of some very ugly coal mining area, and maybe you don't develop that as a geopark. But as an SSSI, of course, they have their importance as they are. And UNESCO, I found a leaflet or a booklet on the UNESCO website whose title is below. 2017, UNESCO Global Geoparks contributing to sustainable development goals. So the United Nations has 20 sustainable development goals. This is very much pitched at justifying the United Nations through the UNESCO and the geoparks. And they're particularly thinking, of course, of developing countries. And this is a very interesting parallel to think about when we compare our geoparks with how would you develop those geoparks in parts of Africa or India. And there they've got some great examples where geoparks are showing great imagination in talking to the people. This is why this thing is happening, why we're building a hotel here, why we're improving some educational provision, obviously improving social conditions, educating all people, including girls, educating people about climate change and sustainability. So those are core UNESCO things, and things which I guess are relatively easy to do through something like a geopark. So I've written there very different functions in developed and developing countries. Yes, because of course, a role of the Northwest Highland Geopark is not necessarily to improve the education of girls. Let's say that's not, I hope it's not an issue here. And it's probably not so much to bring the local people out of abject poverty into a sort of more sustainable lifestyle. But it's useful to remember that those are core functions in other nations. So, you know, it's a great thing that this is such an international movement, and this is worth keeping in mind. And I think the international aspect then plays well in those two senses. I think one, UNESCO and the United Nations, most people agree, I think, are good things. And the fact that the UK and other wealthy nations are part of that, we're presumably putting in money, which then gets redistributed to nations that need that money. But having that knowledge of a kind of international educational purpose is a great thing. And then secondly, underpinning the whole business, of course, I would stress again what I started with, the international aspect of the designation of importance of these sites. Why is it that we're conserving this place but not that place, that kind of thing. You've seen these pictures, I'm sure, on the website, and indeed some of you may be pictured in these pictures, but I just wanted to bring it back to the Northwest Geopark. And I don't go there as much as I should. Regrettably, I live at the other end of the country. We play on here the Bristol dinosaur. We have Triassic dinosaurs, so we use that for these purposes. But these images of fieldwork and enthusiastic young people, all of that, we do the same thing, but we just use whatever we have locally to hand. And again, some images of kids who are highly impressionable. They will absorb anything we tell them, which is wonderful. We have to be sure we tell them good stuff, of course, but it's a great asset as well in justifying the continuation and the enthusiasm and so on of these institutions, and the fantastic countryside of the geopark. So I think the future is good. If you are not aware or fully aware that this is a very international thing, and in other countries, as I mentioned, like China and many countries in Africa, South America, the enthusiasm from a broad sector of society to develop geoparks is extraordinary, and it's worth knowing, it's worth remembering. So this is nothing to be embarrassed about or to think, oh, this is just a thing for Europe or something. People are really excited about it, and that's great. And then, of course, connecting it through UNESCO with educational initiatives and including attempting to educate people, make them more thoughtful about the environment, about sustainability, about STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering subjects, the need for more young people to get engaged and get interested and look for careers in these areas, all of which are massively positive, of course. The challenge is to be economically sustainable. I need hardly say that, but it's true everywhere. Each country has its own way of handling that aspect. It looks from our position, and I don't know if this is true or not, but it does rather look in some countries in Europe, like maybe Germany or France, it is rather easier to get a certain amount of government funding for these kinds of initiatives. It seems rather easier without being constantly queried and questioned. Do you really need to employ people? Can't you make enough money from the gift shop to pay salaries and stuff like that? It is harder in the United States and the United Kingdom because government tries to be small. Government looks very big to me, but there we are. They claim that they're a small government type of system, which means that you try to engage or encourage peripheral aspects of society to become self-sustaining in a financial way, which is quite difficult. And the final point being, of course, running through all of this, I've been trying to stress the scientific aspect and what's exciting about the scientific aspect of the Geopark and the SSSIs is that we are custodians of, we have a responsibility for, as a nation, we have a responsibility for a remarkable number of internationally important sites. And some would argue it's partly the history of the development of geology. We all know that the founders of geology were all Scots. I'm sorry, they were all Scotsmen, but there we are. Hutton, Lyell, Murchison, who else do you need? And of course, because they wrote the books, they used Scottish examples. Therefore, a lot of Scottish localities and more widely, a lot of British localities immediately climb up the international scale because they were designated first, if you want. Type locality of Cambrian, Ordovician-Silurian, they have to be in Wales, and the type of the Devonian has to be in Devon because that's where they were named. With a different history, of course, that could all be in another country, but there we are, we've got that. And then curiously, something we comment on, but nobody's ever fully explained, is that the UK is a tiny place, but it actually compresses a ridiculous amount of geology into the one country. We could have been like North Germany, which is just a lot of sandy, tertiary rock, and that's about it. You know, the whole area of the UK could be the same. But we're lucky, I think we're very lucky having that diversity. And so my general point then is to stress the scientific importance on the one hand and the public good on the other, and to make a case, I hope, which is probably mainly familiar to most of you, that our endeavors in these areas are massively important. And that we should be seeing what we're doing as a global scale, an international scale movement. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.